In Parshas Lech, of course, we have the mitzvah of Milah, in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avram Avinu that he should circumcise his entire bias and enter into a bris. And in addition, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avram that it's not enough that he does Milah, but that he should really make sure that every child of 8 days old should be circumcised. So this we have in Parshas Lecha. There are a few topics regarding Milah that I'd like to speak to you about, and they're all pretty much related to the concept of a bracha. The general rule is that every mitzvah gets a bracha. Occasionally, we have an exceptional situation where a mitzvah will get two brachos. Now, if the mitzvah gets two brachos and one bracha is on the mitzvah, the other bracha is probably not on the mitzvah. Like, take, for example, the case of Hanukkah or Purim. True that we make two brachos, but it's hard to believe that the two brachos are on the mitzvah, be it Hadlokas Ner Chanukah or Kriyas HaMegillah. The second bracha, Shosa Nisim Lavosenu, is common to both Chanukah and to Megillah, and likely it's not on the mitzvah. It's more of a birchas shevach v'odaya, thanking Hashem for the great miracles. In fact, the poskim say that if you didn't make that bracha at the time of the adlaka, or the time of the Kriyas HaMegillah, you could make it at a different time. And we have a rule in Birchas HaMitzvah that every Birchas HaMitzvah is recited over l'asiyason, meaning prior to the asiyah. In the case of Shosan Nisim Lavosenu, there's no requirement, apparently, of over l'asiyason. I mean, Chazal would like to guarantee that we don't forget that bracha, so they organize it in such a way that at the time of the asiyas mitzvah, we'll make that bracha. But the bracha is a birchas shevach v'odoya. And if I would ask you the question, do we have a precedent for a mitzvah that gets two separate brachos on two separate obligations, and the brachos are both related to those mitzvos or to that single mitzvah? We'll be hard-pressed to find examples of that. But there might be an example right here in the mitzvah of Milah. So, for example, the Moel will make a bracha, Shekichanu Mitzvos V'Tzivanu Ala Milah, and the father will make a bracha, Lachniso Bebriso Shel Avram Avinu. But even the bracha of the father is apparently a birchas mitzvah, and the nusach is a nusach of a birchas mitzvah. So one of the questions I'd like to raise today is, why do we recite two brachos on the mitzvah of Milah? Another question I wanted to address is a question that was addressed many centuries ago by the Rivash, who lived in Spain about 600 years ago. His interest is in the bracha on Pidyon HaBen. And he says that there's a fundamental difference in the Nusach HaBracha between the father who's poda his son and the son who's poda himself in event that his father was not poda him. Of course, we have to wait till the boy is bar mitzvah. Otherwise, his bracha is only b'toras chinuch, so that he's not capable also of pidyon because he has to have kinyonim and so forth. So the Rivash writes that when the father is poda his son, the bracha would be al pidyon aben, with an al. Whereas if the son is poda himself, the Rivash claims that then the bracha is liftos, with a lamed. Now, just to review some of the basics, the Gemara Psachim on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, going on to Zayin Amud Beis, a whole sugya about whether we make the bracha, in that case, with regard to B'dikas Chametz, al bir Chametz, or livdok es Chametz, or levayer es Chametz, I should say. And this sugya starts with bir Chametz, but it goes on to many other brachos, and the Rishonim on that daf will try very hard to come up with rules and regulations that determine, that guide us as to whether or not the nuscha bracha should be with an al or a lamed. Now, there are many, many different rules and many different Rishonim. I'm just going to focus on one rule. The Gemara says that in the case of bir chametz, lo sagile de lav iu mevaris chametz, meaning there's no absolute law that requires that he himself destroy his chametz, but rather he can send someone else to destroy his chametz, which makes it a mitzvah that's efshal l'kaima al yidei shliach. And the Gemara says that then the bracha shifts from a lamed to an al. So in the case of tefillin, for example, there's no shlichus. It's a mitzvah that I have to do personally myself. So the bracha on tefillin will be lehaniach. Those who have a second bracha for the tefillin shel rosh will have to look for another rule as to why the bracha on shel rosh is with an al. But certainly I cannot send a shliach to put on tefillin for me, even in the case of tefillin shel rosh. So that question has to be addressed within the broader context of the rules. As I said, there are manifold rules. In the case of yeshiva b'sukkah, for example, the Gemara assumes that the bracha would have to be leishev b'sukkah with a lamed, because you cannot send a shliach to sit in the sukkah for you. You've got to be in the sukkah yourself. Now, in the case of Mikra Megillah, one would wonder whether or not you're reading the Megillah or someone else is reading the Megillah for you. So we have a principle called Shomer Ka'ona, which means that when you hear the Megillah being read by someone else, it's as if you read the Megillah. And therefore, one would assume that Mikra Megillah would not lend itself to shlichus. And then if the bracha is al Mikra Megillah, we're going to have to find another rule to justify why the bracha is on an al. Because you have to hear the Megillah. I can't say you go hear the Megillah for me. And the Rambam comes up with an amazing chiddush that Megillah should be compared to Netilas Yadayim. And again, I don't want to get into this now, but there's another rule of thumb that a mitzvah which is only a reshus and is not an absolute obligation gets a brach with an al, like al Netilas Yadayim. Because you could decide whether you want to eat a meal and wash and fulfill that mitzvah of Netilas Yadayim, and therefore to indicate that the bracha is on a reshus as opposed to a chova, again we shift the bracha from lamed to al. And the Rambam claims that Mikra Megillah, insofar as it's a mitzvah dirabanan, It's like a rishus, meaning on the scale of obligations, we will put a mitzvah d'Rabbanan on a lower level vis-a-vis a mitzvah d'oraisa, and to indicate that that chova is a secondary kind of chova insofar as it's only d'Rabbanan, we're going to classify it as a rishus, again, only relative to a mitzvah d'oraisa, and therefore you get a bracha with an al. And if that be the case, then one would wonder about hadlokas ner Chanukah, because that too is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, and yet the bracha for ner Chanukah is with a lamed, lahadlik. According to the Rambam's reasoning, the bracha for Chanukah, like the bracha for Megillah, is relatively speaking a rishus, and therefore it should get an al. So why is the bracha on ner Chanukah with a lamed? But getting back to the mitzvah of Milah, which is our focal point for today, we find that according to the Rivash, in the case of Pidyon Ben, and we'll see if we can make an analogy to Milah, the bracha is going to be with an al unless the child himself, when he becomes bar mitzvah, is poda himself. And the Rivash explains why would the bracha of the father vis-a-vis his son in Pidyon Ben be with an al Pidyon Ben, not liftos, but al. And the Rivash answers because the mitzvah Pidyon Ben is listed in the Mishnah in Kiddushin as mitzvahs ha'av al haben. Now the question is how to interpret those words of the Mishnah, mitzvahs ha'av al haben. One way is to understand it that it's a mitzvah on the father vis-a-vis his son. The other way to understand it is that basically it's al haben. The obligation is on the son himself, but obviously he's a 30-year-old baby. He doesn't have the ability to make the bracha and do the mitzvah pidyon. So it's the father who's now filling in for the son to do the act of pidyon on behalf of his son. And the radical breakthrough of this Rivash is that the mitzvah of Pidyon Ben is not really the father's mitzvah. It's a mitzvah incumbent al haben. The father is just going to be an appoint. The Torah, so to speak, is appointing him as a shliach to implement the Pidyon Ben on behalf of his son, but the chiyuv itself is on the son. And if you've ever heard of Rab Baruch Ber Leibovich, he wrote a sefer called the Birkas Shmuel. In his writings on Masechta Kiddushin, where the sugya has mitzvahs ha'av al haben, he claims that there are two categories of brachos. There's a bracha that reflects the chovas gavra. I'll try to explain that term. And then there's a bracha on the kiyum hamitzvah. The bracha on the chovas gavra is a bracha with a lamed. And that only applies when the person who is doing the mitzvah is also the person who's obligated in the mitzvah. So he could make a bracha on the chovas gavra, which is with a lamed. So according to the Birkas Shmuel, the lamed means on my obligation. But if someone else is fulfilling and doing the Ma'aseh mitzvah on behalf of someone else, so you now split between the Kiyum mitzvah and the Chovas Gavra, and the bracha could no longer be on the Chovas Gavra because the person who's doing the Ma'aseh mitzvah is not chayav. He's doing it on behalf of someone else. And to indicate that the bracha is on the Kiyum mitzvah now, not on the Chovas Gavra, we shift the nusach from a nusach of lamed to a nusach of al. So whereas lamed is, I am obligated to do this, which according to the Birkas Shmuel is called the Chovas Gavra. So that's a bracha with a lamed. A bracha with an al is not on the Chovas Gavra, but rather on the Kiyum HaMitzvah. So I'm doing the Ma'aseh mitzvah, but really I am filling in for the Gavra who's chayav in the mitzvah. to create a kiyum mitzvah. And therefore, the bracha shifts from a lamed to an al. And if that be the case, then perhaps we could make the following leap of faith, which is the analogy that I indicated before, that in the mitzvah of Milah, the chiyuv of Milah, which is called again in the Mishnah as chovas ha'av mitzvahs aval ben, is really on the ben. He's obligated to circumcise himself. The father will fill in for him as the first like starting pitcher on the game to implement that chiyuv Milah, but the father is only acting really on behalf of the son. And therefore his bracha, if let's say, for example, the father knows how to do the Milah, a lot of very religious people who have sons will go out of their way to learn how to do at least part of the Milah, what we call the chituch, and that's sort of like an extra element. Instead of being mechabi the moel, they will do the Milah, the father will do the Milah, but the bracha, according to the Rivash, will be al ha-Milah, not lamul, but al ha-Milah, because in that case, the father is really like the moel. Just like the moel doesn't have a chovas gavra on Milah, he's only filling in for, let's call it the son in this case. So to the father doesn't really have the chovas gavra. It's mitzvahs ha'av ala ben. And the father is really just doing the Milah as a long arm, so to speak, as an agent, as a representative of the son. So the son in that case, and this is how the Rambam actually paskins, will make the bracha lomul if he's bar mitzvah and he was never gemalt, whereas the father will make the bracha al hamilah. But here's where life gets complicated. The father has another bracha, a second bracha, which is uniquely his bracha, and that's the bracha that we mentioned earlier, lahachniso bibriso. And it's not a bracha with an al, but rather with a lamed, apparently indicating that even if I accept the Rivash and I apply the logic of the Rivash of Pidyon Haben by analogy to Milah, and I assume that the father is only implementing the Maisa Milah on behalf of his son, and the son is the Gavra Bar Chiyuva, but the father is likewise a Gavra Bar Chiyuva. And let me try to explain that based on the original question that we started with today. Why are there two brachos on the mitzvah of Milah? Now, in Lumdus, and the name of this limud is Lumdus on the Parsha, we have a distinction between the action and the result of the action. It's one of the most fundamental principles in Brisker Lumdus. Actually, the one who worked on this a lot was Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, if you know that name. And he was a Talmud of Reb Chaim, and he was also a Talmud of the Chofetz Chaim, but he speaks very often about, let's say, the mitzvah of makeh. The mitzvah of makeh is not the maisa of setting up the makeh, of putting up the fence around the roof, as much as it is the totzas ha-maisa, right? The result of the maisa. And he gives many, many examples throughout his writings. You know, if somebody would do a research and put it all together, make a whole essay out of it, of examples where the mitzvah is on the totzah. Really, the maisa is only, in a sense, what we call a hechetimtza. It's a technicality in order to achieve a totzah. And there's a machlokas rishonim about ner Shabbos, for example. Let's say you had a ner that was already lit way before the time of the mitzvah of ner Shabbos. You know, it was miba'od yom gadol, and whether or not you have to put out the ner in order to rekindle it. And this apparently depends upon whether the mitzvah of ner Shabbos is the Maisad Laka, which seems to be indicated by the bracha, lahadlik ner shel Shabbos, or no. The bracha is really on the ner dolok, the totzah. But getting back again to the mitzvah of Milah, we might suggest that there are two mitzvahs of Milah. One is on the Maisa Milah, and the other is on the Totzas HaMaisa. Because as we said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands Avram Avinu to do the Maisa Milah, but to also bring his himself and his family members into the bris. That's why we make a bracha lachniso bebriso shel Avram Avinu. That second bracha is not on the Ma'aseh Milah. The Ma'aseh Milah is incumbent upon the son himself. The father is only a kind of a shliach, hence the father will make a bracha al, like any mitzvah that lends itself to shlichus. But there's an additional bracha on another chova, which we're suggesting, again, I'm just suggesting it, is a mitzvah that's incumbent on the father, specifically on the father. And that's lachniso bebriso shel Avram Avinu, which the father will make that bracha with a lamed, because that is his obligation. In fact, I'll mention the Tosas Rid in Masechta Yevamo, in Masechta Kiddushin, very famous Chiddush of the Tosas Rid. The Tosas Rid says, Tosfos asks a kasha, and the Tosas Rid wants to come to answer the kasha. Tosfos asks a kasha, well, why does the Gemara need a special pasuk to exempt a mother from the obligation of bris? And the Gemara derives from a pasuk called oso velo osa. And Tosfos asked, wait a minute, bris milah is a mitzvah asay shazman grama. And as such, a woman is exempt from the mitzvah of milah, regardless of whether you derive it from a pasuk of oso velo osa. Why then why is it necessary for the Gemara to come up with this yalfusa? Why not simply apply the principle of mitzvahs asay man grama? The mitzvah is during the day and not at night. The mitzvah is on the 8th day and not on the 9th day. And amongst many, many answers that are offered to this question, the Tosas Rid has perhaps the most radical answer. And he says that the mitzvah is not just to do the milah, but it's to prepare everything so that you can guarantee that the child is brought into the briso shel Avram Avinu. And that element of guaranteeing will apply day and night, 8th day, 9th day, 10th day, whatever day it is, till the end of life, to do everything you can. That's not a time-limited mitzvah. And it could be, therefore, that the chiyuv of the mother, if not for the pasuk oso velo osa, would be to guarantee that the milah is done. And at that point, I would like to jump over to Tzipora, our favorite Tzipora. Moshe Rabbeinu does not implement the milah on his children. At certain points, you could say it's because of danger or whatever. But Tzipora grabs what's called a tzur. A tzur is a stone that has a certain point to it, and she implements the milah. Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu do the same thing? Was he not a Talmud Chacham that was, scholarly enough to understand that the mitzvah of milah is incumbent and it's urgent and it can be fulfilled right now with a tzur? So I want to share with you an amazing chiddush of the Chassam Sofer. As I always point out, when I get to Yolam HaEmes, I have only one taina against my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik. He never mentions the Chassam Sofer. I think I know why, because the Chassam Sofer is such a machadish that the Rav didn't want to expose himself to the Torah of the Chassam Sofer, so he could come up on his own with chidushim. But the creativity of the Chassam Sofer, the originality, sometimes he says things that are really way out, is amazing. And I wish I had been trained in the Chassam Sofer. Let me give you the background of this Chassam Sofer. We have two principles that govern mitzvos. One is called zrizim makdimim lemitzvos, which means that we do the mitzvah at the earliest possible time. There's another rule that governs a mitzvah, and that's called hidur mitzvah, to beautify, to enhance the mitzvah. Zeh keli v'adveu. You buy a nice talis, you buy a beautiful pair of tefillin, you build a beautiful sukkah, and so forth and so on. Maybe even have a beautiful menorah for Hanukkah. Comes along the Chassam Sofer, and he asks the following question: should we postpone a mitzvah for the sake of hidur mitzvah? Meaning, let's say today I could fulfill the mitzvah but without hidur, But tomorrow, if I wait and postpone the mitzvah, I will be able to achieve hidur mitzvah. Which is greater in a tug of war, in a clash between, on the one hand, mitzvah habol yod chal tach mitzenes rizus b'mitzvah, don't delay a mitzvah. On the other hand, hidur mitzvah. Would we be allowed and even required to delay a mitzvah for the sake of hidur mitzvah? A fascinating question. It has many, many implications. It might even be relevant to kfuras hames, whether or not we should delay the kfura in order to have more people come to the funeral and so forth and so on. Comes along the Chassam Sofer and he says he has no doubt in his mind that Zriza Makdimim LeMitzvos overrides Hidur Mitzvah. We do not delay a mitzvah, Lo Shohim Mitzvah, you'll see it on the page if you printed it out, for the sake of Hidur Mitzvah. Do the mitzvah now. And he says that certainly that was the opinion of Tzipora. And therefore, Tzipora would not tolerate delaying the Milah once it was possible and feasible to do so, because of Zriza Makdim Mitzvahs. What was Moshe Rabbeinu's thought process? And the Chassam Sofer thinks that maybe Moshe Rabbeinu felt that waiting and delaying with the mitzvah would allow for a hidur mitzvah. And why? Because to do a milah with a tzur, which is a stone, a sharply edged stone, is not really the best way of doing milah. But the Chassam Sofer says, no. We cannot possibly accept that Moshe Rabbeinu would delay a mitzvah for the sake of hidur mitzvah. So what does, according to the Chassam Sofer, what is the logic that motivates Moshe Rabbeinu to delay the mitzvah of Milah? And he says the following, that to do the Milah with a sakin shel barzel, a knife that's made of metal, is a mitzvah min hamuvchar. And Moshe Rabbeinu holds that a mitzvah min hamuvchar overrides zriza makdim lemitzvahs. The trouble with this Chassam Sofer is he doesn't tell you what does he mean by mitzvah min hamuvchar. Why is mitzvah min hamuvchar any different than hidur mitzvah? He claims that even the Moshe Rabbeinu would admit that we don't postpone a mitzvah for the sake of hidur mitzvah to beautify. What's mitzvah min hamuvchar? And Berzon claims that from this Chassam Sofer I learn that mitzvah min hamuvchar is fundamentally different than hidur mitzvah. Again, if you ask, I know that many of you have children who, grandchildren who learned in yeshivas. You ask a yeshiva bacha, and if you don't know where to find them, come tomorrow to Yerushalayim. You'll find about 1 million of them. Ask them, what's the difference between hidur mitzvah, mitzvah min hamuvchar? And I think you'll get a blank stare. And they'll say it's anonymous. I don't know. Check it out. In my humble opinion, mitzvah min hamuvchar is not hidur mitzvah. Hidur mitzvah means going beyond the mitzvah itself and beautifying it. Has nothing to do with the gufa shel mitzvah. Let's say the gufa shel mitzvah goes from 0 to 100. Hidur mitzvah takes you beyond 100. It's like getting an A+. I don't know if you ever got an A+. But mitzvah min hamuvchar takes you from 90 to 100. What do I mean? Mitzvah min hamuvchar is part and parcel of the mitzvah itself. Moshe Rabbeinu felt that a sakin shel barzel is not just an enhancement of the mitzvah of Milah, but it's part of the gufa shel Milah. And you cannot compare a Milah with a tzur to a Milah with a sakin shel barzel, even without the pasuk zeh keli yamveu, because a sakin shel barzel is mitzvah min hamuvchar. This is the way I want to interpret the Chassam Sofer. And as you know, I'm working very hard on the mitzvah of Kiddush. The Rashba says in Masechta Shabbos, on Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis, that Yayin LeKiddush is mitzvah min hamuvchar. And therefore, if you have a choice between Ner Chanukah which is only derabanan, and you have limited funds, you can use your funds to buy yayin for kiddush. The Rashba claims that you will buy yayin lekiddush because of mitzvah min amuvchar b'yayin. As I state in the Rashba, you can check me out on this Chav Gimel Amid Beis in Shabbos, Masechta Shabbos. I'm going to argue that when the Rashba wants yayin lekiddush, it's not just adding and embellishing and beautifying the mitzvah like zeh kelim yaveu hidur mitzvah. No, it's part and parcel of mitzvah kiddush. Although you could fulfill the mitzvah of kiddush without yayin, but nevertheless, part and parcel, you go from 80, 90 to 100 when you get yayin for kiddush, and that's going to override a mitzvah d'Rabbanan because we're dealing with a mitzvah min amuvchar of a mitzvah d'oraisa of zachar es yom Shabbos l'kadsho. So if you're following me until this point, we can summarize two chidushim that I think are very important for today. And maybe we'll have time for a third chiddush. Chiddush number one is that unlike any other mitzvah, bris milah gets two brachos. And that's very strange, very unique. It's an exception to the rule, and it has to be justified. And at the same time, we want to understand why the two brachos are formulated, one with an al and one with a lamed. So chiddush number one is that there are two mitzvahs in Milah. One is the Maisa Milah and the Chovas Gavra. The other is the Kiyuma mitzvah of Knisa Lebris, which is the Totzah HaMaisa. And herein lies the difference between the father and the son. The father has a chiyuv, as long as the child is a minor, to bring the child into the bris of Avram Avinu. That's called the Totzah HaMaisa. The Maisa Milah is the father is replacing the son as the son's agent, and we base ourselves on the tshuva of the Rivash regarding Pidyon Haben, and therefore the father, when he makes the Milah, he will make the bracha with an al, because his Maisa Milah is not a reflection of the Chovas Gavra. He's only representing the son to implement the mitzvah of Milah. But the second bracha, which is on the second mitzvah of Lachniso Bebriso, the father will make with a lamed, because that's his personal chiyuv. And how much more so if the father doesn't implement the Milah, or let's say he dies and then the child becomes 13 years old, he'll certainly make the bracha of Lachnisa with a lamed, because now he has an addition to the mitzvah of Lamul es Atzmo, meaning the Maisa Milah Chovas Gavra. He also has a mitzvah on the Totzah HaMaisa, namely the Knisa Lebris. The second chiddush for today is that Moshe Rabbeinu would certainly kowtow to his wife Tzipora, which is always a good thing to say. You know, your wife is always right. That Zrizim Makdimul Mitzvahs overrides Hidur Mitzvah. But, says Lechsam Sofer, the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu disagreed with his wife, not a good thing, and delayed the mitzvah of Milah, is because he wanted to do the mitzvah of Milah as a mitzvah min amuvchar with a sakin shel barzel as opposed to a tzur, and the Chassam Sofer would seemingly be inclined to think that mitzvah min amuvchar is not to be identified with Hidur mitzvah. If we have time, Rabbos, I'd like to add a third chidush. Now, let me give an introduction to part 3 of this shir. There's something called in Hilchos Brachos a matbea aruch. Aruch is spelled Aleph, Resh, Vav, Langechav. Now, the word aruch means long, but I believe, and I'm going to quote my Rebbe to prove this, that a matbea katzar, a short matbea of bracha, versus a matbea aruch, a long matbea of bracha, it has nothing to do with counting words. It's a fundamental conceptual distinction. So I want to share with you something that I heard many, many years ago from my Rebbe Rav Nisan Alpert Ol V'Sholem. And somehow he was a Rebbe at MTA, To this day, people don't understand how that happened, but in any event, so he was my Rebbe in my junior class when I was approximately 17 years old. And he explained that a Matbea Aruch is a dual-themed Matbea. Usually, every bracha gets one theme. But there are rare occasions, exceptions to the rule, where you have two themes that are collapsed and combined into one bracha. And when that happens, you get a matbea aruch. Again, it doesn't really matter how long the bracha is. I don't believe that we're going to count words. But a matbea aruch, for example, has both a psicha with a Baruch Atah Hashem and a chasima, again with Baruch Atah Hashem. So take the example of Birchas Erusin for marriage. The Rambam writes in Perek Gimel Mehilchas Ishus that bracha is a Birchas HaMitzvah. And therefore, as opposed to other Rishonim, the Rambam insists that we make the bracha before the Maisa Kiddushin, before he gives her the ring. However, the bracha on Erusin is a very complicated bracha. It's complex not just because of the size and the length of the bracha, how many words it has, but because it opens with a baruch and closes with a baruch that makes it a matbea aruch. So Rav Alpert explains that why is the bracha on Erusin a matbea aruch? Because it has two themes. It opens with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. And that is a birchas ha-mitzvah, thanking Hashem for the opportunity to do a mitzvah. But then it goes on, al harayos ve'al hanesuos lanu shehitu lanu yidei chuppah v'kiddushin, which is a whole longer ma'aser, but that's not a birchas ha-mitzvah, it's a birchas shevach v'odaya. And therefore, that bracha is a complex bracha that requires both a psicha b'baruch and a chasima b'baruch. That's the nature of a bracha in a matbea aruch. Now, I don't understand something. Are you telling me that if you have a bracha that combines both the mitzvah and the shevach, and therefore it's a multifaceted bracha that has two dimensions to it, that it becomes a matbea aruch? But the strange thing is, and this is what I wanted to ask Rabbi Alpert, but I never got a chance to ask him, we find that in certain cases, what Chazal do is they take the Birchas HaMitzvah and they separate it from the Shevach V'Odaya, creating two different brachos. Take, for example, a Hadlik Ner Shel Chanukah Al Mikra Megillah. They don't make a Matbea Aruch and add Shasa Nisim Lavosenu, thanking Hashem for the great miracle of the Ner in the Migdash, or for the great miracle of the Yeshua and the Hatzalah from Haman, but rather they set up two brachos. So what I was trying to rack my brains to try to figure out, what's the rule of thumb? When did the Chazal decide to formulate a Matbea Aruch, which combines two different elements as a multifaceted bracha, but it's all part of one bracha? And when did they decide to separate the two elements, allowing for each element to stand on its own as a separate bracha? So, for example, in the case of Milah, we have two brachos. But I'm going to assume that there's no Matbea Aruch in the case of Milah as opposed to Erusin, because even though Erusin's element of Shevach is on the bris that's created through the Nisuin, through the marriage, a bris between him and her, and in that sense it's very, very parallel to the bris between us and the Ribono Shel Olam through the Milah. But nevertheless, in terms of mitzvah, Erusin is one single, indivisible mitzvah of ki yikach ish isha. The bris element that results from ki yikach ish isha is a separate element that's not connected to the mitzvah, to the chova of ki yikach ish isha. Hence, it is a subject of Shevach Vodoya that should be attached to Nisuin. And Chazal did that by creating a Bracha Aruka, a Matbea Aruch. But in the case of Milah, we're going to say the following. The son is obligated in the mitzvah of Milah, of Maisa Milah Chovas Gav. The father has his own mitzvah of Lachniso Bebriso, of bris. And therefore, since there are two gavras here, hence there are two obligations and two mitzvahs, we now need two separate brachos. So again, let me just repeat the third chiddush. With regard to Nisuin, there's only one indivisible obligation, and that's Nisuin, to get married, ki yikach ish isha. The Shevach aspect does not separate itself and emerge on its own 2 feet independent of the mitzvah of Nisuin. It's just part of the bris of the Kiddushin of the, right, we call it Kiddushin because of the Hegdish aspect of the bris between a husband and a wife. That element of Shevach for the bris will now be integrated into the single bracha of Nisuin, of Eres. However, in the case of Milah, we're going to claim that Chazal established 2 different brachos and did not integrate the 2 brachos to form one whole, which is called the Matbea Aruch, but rather they have 2 small brachos, if you will, short brachos, and that's because we're dealing with 2 different obligations. And I would only have the chutzpah to say that there are 2 different obligations, that bris is not just a byproduct, and we want to be Meshabech HaKadosh Baruch Hu on giving us the opportunity to enter into a bris, but rather it's a separate chov. I would only have the chutzpah to present that idea to you based on the Rivash. Meaning that the Rivash is insisting that there are 2 different chiyuvim, 2 different obligations. There's the obligation of the son. In that context, the father is merely a shliach, hence the bracha is al, and there's another obligation where the bracha is belamed, when the father brings his son into the bris. And having established 2 different mitzvahs with 2 different gavras that are each one respectively chayav, the Rabbanan established 2 different brachos rather than collapse them into one matbea aruch. Okay, Rabbi, say this is what I wanted to share with you for today. I mean, there's a lot more, but 3.
And when the son does it himself.
So now he's going to make 2 brachos. Now both brachos will be with a lamed. And that's how the Rama paskins, that when the son is maling himself, which he might do, when he gets to bar mitzvah, if he is going to be with a lamed, lamu. And the second obligation now incumbent on the son is to enter into the bris of Avram Avinu, and therefore he'll make another bracha with a lamed, because now there's one gavra, but the one gavra is chayav in 2 mitzvahs.
So why won't you say by the if he's brisa bismano that the father he's not really a shaliach, because at that time the child can't do that on his own. He has the responsibility to do it for himself later when he has the ability to do it. But at this point, he doesn't have. It's not a mitzvah on himself. The mitzvah is.
So then, Joe, if you're correct, you're going to have to explain to me Pidyon Aben, according to the Rivash. Meaning, in Pidyon Aben, the child is 30 days old. He's not capable of doing a pidyon. He can't redeem himself. He doesn't even own any money, let alone give 5 slot to the Kohen. So why not say that at this point, the Torah imposed the obligation on the father? And that is what's rejected by the Rivash. Again, if not for the Rivash, you and I could have said that the father's chiyuv in Pidyon Aben, and hence also in Milah, is his own personal chiyuv. And that's what the Birkas Shmuel in that Chiddush says, that if not for the Rivash, the other Rishonim are going to say that the mitzvah is now incumbent on the father. Until the child emerges as a gadol, the Torah imposed that obligation on the father. The Rivash is the one who says, no, the father is only representing the son. And therefore, says the Rivash, the nafkamina is going to be that the father is going to make a bracha al Pidyon Aben, not liftos es haben. When the child becomes a gadol, and his father was not poda him, bikatnuso, then the son will make the bracha liftos with a lamed. That's the Rivash. We're just taking the Rivash, as I called it, a leap of faith, and applying it to Milah, because that's how the Rivash reads the Mishnah of Mitzvas Ha'av al Hadben. Okay, then Rabbosai, here's where we're going to stop for today. And it's a nice haschola.
Shalom.
Hopefully we'll be able to continue. Shkad. Thank you so
Good.
much.